Good evening, everybody. Yes, it is I, your world-renowned historian. Now, before we start the video, they tell me that if you want to be a successful YouTuber, you have to tell your audience to like this video, dislike if you're so inclined, comment, share it around, and hit that subscribe button, because the people who write how to be successful YouTuber articles think you're all idiots. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, let's get on with tonight's video. Do you guys ever wonder what happened to this guy? Or this guy? Or that guy? Or yes, even that guy. Or even all those guys and gals who were nowhere near these famous historical events and couldn't get that day off of work, so they couldn't make it to the photo op. What happened to all those guys and gals? Because, damn if I don't think about that kind of stuff all the time. You know, I'm about to bring all my thousands of dollars of training as a world-renowned historian to bear for you people. Are you ready? Throughout history, there's been quite a few humans. No, really, it's true. There's been a lot of us. You know, back in the 60s, one of my favorite authors, Arthur C. Clarke, wrote the words, "Behind every man alive there now stands 30 ghosts, for that is the ratio by which the dead outnumber the living." Now, and when Clarke wrote that, when there had been 30 dead people for every one person currently alive, when he wrote that, there were 3.5 billion people on Earth. Now there's more than twice that many, 7.6 billion. And that's not all the same people, because a lot of them died off since then. So all in all, it's estimated that there's been 107 billion Homo sapiens in the world ever. That's a crazy number. So it's just a simple fact that when writing history, you gotta leave most of them out. The vast majority, in fact. You gotta cut us down to the highlights of the highlights, as a great man once said. If you want to be able to tell any particular story of any particular era with anything approaching coherence, you gotta leave out most of it. There's kind of a strange, like, poignant, bittersweet tragedy in this, really, if you think about it. Like, most of us, statistically, you, me, everybody watching this video is going to be forgotten by history. And yet, that's not to say these people aren't interesting. You know, I've struck up conversations with people in bars who tell me more interesting stories about their lives than many things I've read or heard in history books or stories. You know, there's a fascinating tapestry of humanity out there, and at the end of the day, most of it is not going to make it into the story. Now, you might say that this cutting process is fairly easy for anything before the modern era, because, for the most part, we just don't have a ton of information about anyone who wasn't rich and powerful. You know, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part, the further back you go, the less reliable sources you have, and the further back you go, the less information you have about people who aren't that era's equivalent of the Clintons and the Bushes and the Trumps. Now, of course, this is going to change somewhat in future generations. You know, historians studying the 21st century will be the first generation faced with too many sources. So the record shows she took a picture of herself with every single meal she ate from age 14 to age 29. But to say there's nothing of the common man in history would be a lie. You know, what we have are hints here and there. They're often the background character of some other document. Occasionally we have their letters. You know, occasionally we have some dirty joke or bawdy piece of graffiti. You know, we have letters from ancient Sumerians, you know, from these merchants to their spouses back home. These merchants would travel to trading hubs to go and get the best price for their goods. And they'd write in that, you know, cuneiform script that looks to us like it should be what the Demon Zool and Ghostbusters writes curses with, but it's what they wrote their letters with. It was their alphabet. And these letters are just like, "Husband, I told you to send me 4 rolls of this kind of cloth, and you sent me 5 rolls of the wrong kind. You idiot." We have the letters of Pliny the Younger, many of which are addressed to the Emperor Trajan, many of which are addressed to his good pal, the historian Tacitus. But here and there are hints of interesting characters in Pliny's purview. You know, there's the court trial that Pliny attends where these two tribes are fighting over a piece of land, and Pliny's tone to his buddy in this letter that he's writing is just so giddy. Like, you can tell that he thinks it's just the funniest thing he's ever heard. And you know, he even basically tells him, "I've aroused your ears, and you'll have to wait until the next time we're together so that I can tell you the rest." He's kind of like baiting him with a little, you know, cliffhanger, so to speak. There's the famous letter where he's dealing with the weirdo Christians in his province. And these weirdo Christians who are just so eager to martyr themselves and follow the example of their leader. And Pliny writes to Trajan, just exasperated, like, the hell do you want me to do with these wackos? They just keep trying to get me to kill them. There's the graffiti in an inn in Pompeii, which translates to, Innkeeper, we pissed in your bed. If you ask me why, I'll confess. It's because there was no chamber pot. It's rather a far cry from I came, I saw, I conquered, isn't it? We have the letter from Polion, written around 200 BC. He's an Egyptian soldier serving in the Roman legions in Europe. Like, can you imagine how strange that must have been? How scary it must have seemed? In the letter he writes to his mother, sister, and brother, and he says, I pray you're in good health, and I make obeisance before the gods on your behalf. And in the letter, Polion notes that he's written them 6 times without hearing back. It's kind of poignant and heartbreaking in a way. I could go on. We have hints and suggestions and inferences here and there of the lives of the lower classes, but nothing like the record that we have of the rich and powerful. And we have almost nothing of the poorest of the poor. That has to be constructed almost entirely from models and archaeological evidence, what little there is. But they've always fascinated me. I guess I've always had that bone in my body. Oddly enough, a memory really sticks out to me of watching the World Series with my family in the early 90s. It was Toronto versus Minnesota, probably 92 or 93, right in that range. And they were showing an outside the park shot at night with all the cars visible by their headlights. And I remember just picking out one car in particular. And I remember thinking, I wonder who that is. That's a true story. I was an odd kid. I think it's worth keeping in mind when we're studying history that behind and around all these huge events that we all see, almost as movie scenes, like they're scripted, they had to have happened this way. Spoiler alert, they weren't. They didn't have to happen that way, but that's kind of how we end up seeing them. Anyways, behind all these scenes and around them, there were real regular schmucks just going about their day. Think about the murder of Caesar in the Senate. Like, this has been depicted in so many plays, movies, artwork, books, etc. It's one of the most famous historical events in history. And by the way, no, he did not say et tu Brute, he said kai su teknon, which is Greek for and you child. Et tu Brute is from Shakespeare. Anyways, the fame of this event and the constant depictions of it probably cloud our picture of it to an extent. It can begin to make the participants feel like movie characters, as I said, and we can begin to forget that there were millions of just everyday schlubs who, when that happened, just kept on going about their day. Like, imagine some farmer living in northern Italy. The news probably reaches him of Caesar's death a few weeks to a month after it happens. He's out there plowing the fields. He's working his ass off like usual. And his homeboy from Rome shows up and he's like, yo, you heard? Caesar got whacked in the Senate. And we imagine that farmer's reaction is like this. When in reality, it probably looked a lot more like this. Damn, Caesar got killed? Well, back to plowing. Caesar never came and plowed that guy's fields. And whoever or whatever replaced Caesar, be it Augustus or the Senate or Cicero or Cato or whatever, they weren't going to come and plow that guy's fields either. And that guy had work to do. He didn't give a shit. He was just some everyday schlub living his life. And in some ways, that's kind of crazy to think about. Like Columbus sailing the ocean blue, the Lincoln assassination, the day the Constitution was signed, the day the Bastille got stormed, or whatever the frick that was, I don't know. The day the Soviet Union was formed, the day Charlemagne was crowned emperor. Pick a crazy, important, significant moment in history, no matter what it was. And there were millions of just everyday Joe Sixpacks just going about their business. Had no idea something important was happening. Didn't care. They had shit to do. I think that's important to keep in mind. Like, there wasn't some, movie soundtrack blaring in the sky when Caesar was murdered, like, whoa, ba, ba, ba. Most people just kind of went about their day. Wasn't a big deal. There could be something like that happening today. That future people will be like, whoa, how did people not freak out when that happened? And did you freak out? No. You just went about your business. You know, you might say in this digital age that, we're more connected than ever and information gets to us fast enough. And so that if something crazy happened, like, we would, in fact, react to it. You might argue that. My response would be, even there, you don't know the significance of things immediately. You know, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, nobody flipped out on that day because nobody understood the significance yet. People just went about their business. Some people were like, whoa, this is kind of like wild. This is kind of wacky. Maybe this guy's not the best for everybody. But for the most part, like, nobody was like, this is the end of the world. Like, most people just went about their business. Finally, the last thing I want to touch on in relation to this topic is how it relates to the discipline of history. Now, some of you are probably under the impression that history is the story of what happened. And in the broadest sense, in the most broad, unsophisticated sense, and yet also paradoxically, in the very specific sense of Ivan Ranke, who I disagree with very mightily, this is true. However, in another very real sense, if we're talking about the literary discipline of history, I think we have to admit to ourselves that history is whatever historians choose to write about. Now, I will fully grant to you all that this sounds like some dumb cliche bullshit. History is written by the winners. Oh, yeah, we never heard that before. But in some sense, even that cliche has some truth to it. We have written sources from 5th century BCE Athens, but we don't from Corinth, or Sparta, or Persia. Why is that? So yes, history tends to be the story of whatever the historians choose to write about. That is why, for most of recorded history, it has been quote-unquote great man history. It's been a political history, the doings of great and powerful men. This is, of course, not to say that there are not great historians all throughout history. We don't throw away historians of the past. You know, it's why modern historians in my field are still engaging with the work of everyone from Herodotus to Tacitus to Edward Gibbon to Theodore Mommsen to Ronald Syme. They are all excellent and they all have something to contribute. But what I'm saying is we all read their work and critique it and engage with it. You know, in the same way that Einstein read Newton and engaged with it, critiqued it, and built upon it. So Mommsen built upon Gibbon, so Syme built upon Mommsen. Of course, we all ain't Edward Gibbon, and we all ain't Isaac Newton, but we can recognize at the same time the greatness and the blind spots of our great predecessors. All historians are products of their time, and they are interested in what they are interested in, often because of the society and cultural trappings of their time. We can't take Herodotus at face value when he discusses the Persians. You know, Mommsen and Syme will have very different ideas about Augustus because of the cultures in which they lived. Roman history written during the 1950s tends to view their imperialism through the binary tone and lens of the Cold War. Now, all of this falls broadly under the category of what is called historiography. Now, the uneducated layman might be tempted to call that bias, or say it's somehow a negative, when in reality it's just completely unavoidable in history, or frankly any humanities discipline. If you say you don't have a perspective, you're lying, and if you're not lying, you're just too blind, so you can't see it. So when did history decide that poor people were worth remembering? Well, sit back and get comfortable, kiddos, because the WRH is about to spin ya a yarn. So basically, up until the first half of the 20th century, college was for rich people. You know, that picture you have of the asshole British stuffed shirt lecturing down to you, yeah, now you can recite the moons of Jupiter in Latin and then in Greek backwards. That's pretty much basically how it was. Oh, and by the way, anytime you see some asshole post that Facebook meme about college reading lists in the early 1900s versus today, oh, back then, oh, they read Homer and shit, and now we just read, like, Archie comics. Like, just remember, that's why. Back then, everyone who went to college was rich kids who went to private school, and they studied all this stuff their entire lives. And now, they let us regular folk into college, and whoa! Oh, things got less intellectual. And then World War II and the GI Bill happened. After that, oh my goodness, did demographics in college change. Suddenly people who never had access to higher education had that access, including women and various minorities. And what do you know? all of a sudden, historians start writing a lot more about historically marginalized groups. Interesting. Another major contributor to historians taking a sudden interest in poor people of all eras happened right around the same time. It was, we might as well say it, communism. Yes, Marxist historians suddenly realized that there was plenty of information about the medieval poor, about the early modern poor, about even the ancient poor. Plenty of content with which to tell their story that had been ignored previously in the elitist culture of professional history. Take, for example, one of the most interesting humans of all time, in my opinion, Bronislaw Geremek. He was born in Warsaw in 1932, and his father was murdered at Auschwitz. My favorite contribution of his was The Margins of Society in Late Medieval Paris. Great book, wonderful book, beautifully written. I strongly recommend you all go read it. Published in 1987, and one of the early contributions of the story of the poor in medieval France. Geremek was a part of Polish politics from his early adulthood, all right up through the communist era, right up until his death in 2008. Yes, I'm sorry if this comes as a shock to you, layman, but your picture of history is largely beholden to professional historians, who are themselves largely beholden to social and cultural conditions beyond their control. Well, this suddenly got a little depressing and fatalist, didn't it? Anyways, the point is, remember the little guy in history, friends. For every major historical event involving one person, there was 10 million schlubs who were just going about their day and couldn't care less about that major historical event. And until next time, yes, standard YouTube outro. Be sure to like or dislike, comment, subscribe, or unsubscribe if you hate me now. Do something. Or not. It's your Google account. You don't have to do anything. That's what they tell you to say. So I'm saying it. But anyway, until next time, I am the world-renowned historian. Be good, kiddos. I'm out.